Welcome to Highly Sensitive, Happily Married, the podcast that teaches you to not only have an easier marriage as a sensitive woman, but to have one that feels more amazing by the day. Where you'll hear relatable stories, love advice that works, and coaching on how to have a marriage where feeling upset and disconnected is a thing of the past, and where instead a sense of loving connection and even fun and lightness is the norm. I'm Hannah Brooks, highly sensitive person, love expert, and marriage coach, and I'm so happy to be on this journey with you. Hello, my lovely friends, and welcome to episode 163, where we are going to talk about, in the very most general sense, but also very tangibly, the thing that makes or breaks a relationship. Before I dive in, though, I want to bring something to your attention. If you have been a listener to this podcast on Apple Podcasts specifically, you may not realize, because I did not realize, and I have a podcast on Apple Podcasts, that they early in this year, they changed the automatic download function. So if you've been subscribed to this podcast, or any other podcasts, but you haven't listened to it in maybe a couple weeks, you will automatically stop downloading the episodes. And some of you might not like that. I know that I like, when I've decided I like a podcast, I like to be able to have that podcast automatically download so I remember. So I'm alerted when there's a new episode, so I remember to listen to it. So you can fix this if you'd like to keep receiving alerts for this podcast and getting downloads by finding my podcast, Highly Sensitive, Happily Married, in your app, and then clicking in the upper right corner where it says unpause downloads. Or in some cases, it might just show like that little download symbol, that arrow that faces down with this tiny little pause button right next to it. All you have to do is press that little pause button and it will unpause and you'll start automatically getting those episodes again. Now, you may have to do that again sometime soon if you've missed an episode or if you've missed 2 episodes. So just keep that in mind. That's something you want to remember and make maybe a little bit of a routine to go unpause those downloads. And this is only for people who've already subscribed. So if you haven't subscribed and you like the idea of getting these podcasts every week, or actually we'll get them 3 out of 4 weeks because that's how often I release them. But if you'd like to get them when they come out and be alerted and have them there on your phone ready for you to listen to, definitely go hit subscribe. All right, now that we've got that shopkeeping out of the way, let's dive into our topic for today. So today I really want to go back to the basics, at least basics for this podcast, because I feel like it's been a while since I've touched in on this. And really this is at the heart of what makes the most impact and changes everything in how you feel in your relationship and everything ultimately in how your relationship actually is. And I really want to start off on this sort of review of a topic with a simple summarizing statement, which is that what you practice grows stronger. What you practice in your relationship, specifically the thoughts you think about it, the ways you have of seeing things within your relationship, your ways of being and interacting in your relationship, and yes, of course, your ways of feeling in your relationship or about your relationship. What you practice in these realms makes or breaks your relationship. And of course, all of these things are things we practice, most often unconsciously. We do these things over and over and over in one way or another, for better or worse. And that makes or breaks our relationship, right? So if we practice relationship enhancing thoughts and relationship enhancing feelings and ways of being and interacting, our relationship's going to grow stronger and stay stronger. And if we practice relationship depleting thoughts and feelings and ways of being and interacting, our relationship's going to grow harder and more unhappy. And extra importantly, we get to actually choose what we practice. And so the thoughts and feelings and behaviors we choose to practice are actually what make or break a relationship. Again, we might not be choosing things consciously. We might often choose things unconsciously or feeling like we're not choosing it. But as that saying goes, no choice is still a choice. Or not making a choice is still a choice or is still making a choice. So choosing your thoughts and feelings and behaviors is an essential practice to make your relationship decent, great, and even amazing. So if this sounds familiar or like a reminder, that is because today really is a kind of a reminder episode, a sort of going back to the roots, because I've been talking about other things lately on the podcast, and many of you listeners possibly haven't even listened to some of the earlier episodes. So if you're somewhat new to this podcast, or if you just haven't started at the beginning, if you haven't gone through all the episodes, a lot of what I'm talking about today is at the very, very heart of, again, what'll make or break a relationship, but also the very heart of this podcast. And I'm going to actually recommend a few really very basic, essential episodes where I've talked about this more, episodes that it really are not to be missed, and will kind of flesh out some of what I'm saying and help you be able to understand this deeply. Because the truth is, some of what I'm saying and what I'm going to say today and what I say in these other episodes is very different than much of what you may have heard. And it's also why it works, why I have such an amazing track record with my clients. In any case, I want to share a bit about this. Again, I'm going to say things in different ways. So even if you've been listening to the podcast for a long time, this is a really important reminder. I think it's important and essential to keep hearing this from various angles, because it really is essential to understand if you want a great or even good marriage, especially as a sensitive person. So one of the most basic understandings is that your thoughts, the thoughts that go through your brain, create your feelings. And your feelings lead to your actions. And your actions, that's what creates your relationship, right? How you act, how you show up in your relationship is what leads to how your relationship actually is. And of course, I would say the same thing to your partner, right? It's true of both of you. So ultimately, our thoughts are at the very source of what creates or kills a great relationship, right? Because a quicker way to say that is our thoughts create our relationship. Now, we're not, describing what's happening in between there, but basically that's how it works. Because your thoughts lead to your feelings, and your feelings lead to your actions, and your actions lead to the results and really the relationship that you have. Now, this means that examining our thoughts and shifting them on purpose, along with doing some nervous system work, both of which are at the very root of our feelings and therefore our actions. These are some of the very biggest things that distinguishes coaching from just marriage advice. So on this podcast, I often give marriage advice. I give you strategies and things you can say even to your significant other that will help things in your relationship. Like last episode, I told you a really useful thing you should do to keep love great, right? Or rejuvenate your love and your connection. But these strategies, this advice, isn't nearly as powerful or useful or as effective if you don't have your foundation solid. And what I mean by your foundation is your internal foundation. In other words, if you don't have your thoughts steering in a good relationship enhancing direction versus a relationship depleting direction like so many of us are prone to. And honestly, we're prone to that because that's the way our brains tend to work when they're left on default. So this internal foundation is what coaching helps you nail down. This is at the heart of what I share on this podcast, and it's part of that unique and very different flavor you sense here in this podcast versus on other relationship podcasts. And it's what I do much more deeply with my clients, right? I can't do it so deeply with all of you at once here, me just talking at you, right? It's an interactive thing that I do individually with my clients in depth. And this is why my approach works. Whereas so many other approaches have failed for my clients in the past. I have lots of clients who come to me after they've tried a lot of things and they're like, nothing worked until I've worked with you. And then suddenly everything's so much better. So this internal foundation is ultimately everything. It is the foundation on which you actually are able to build a great relationship. So I want to talk more about this internal foundation, this practice, this skill really of stewarding or guiding your own thinking, emotions, and ultimately actions or behavior, right? In a way that not just enhances your relationship, but makes it amazing. So this isn't the main topic for today, but this does, of course, also mean knowing how to caretake and guide your nervous system, because your nervous system regulation or dysregulation definitely affects your thinking. And it's why I always make sure my clients are learning this too, are learning how to guide their nervous systems into more and more regulation. So that's also really important, and it is part of this internal foundation. And this really means also consciously guiding your thinking and really practicing guiding your thinking away from relationship depleting places of like worry and inadequacy and blame and judgment. You know, those places our brains love to go. And practicing thinking instead in ways that are generous and accepting and curious and connecting and loving and trusting and admiring, etc. A bit like we practiced in last episode. Because when you practice these ways of thinking, these qualities grow stronger in your relationship between you and your honey, right? When you think in generous ways, your relationship becomes more generous. When you think in loving ways, your relationship becomes more loving. When you think in trusting ways and admiring ways and connecting ways, your relationships becomes all of those things more and more. And I think it's a good sort of way of understanding this is like you can absolutely have the best partner in the world and still be unhappy with him, depending on where your mind goes. And you can have a partner who has a lot of growing to do, right? Like who maybe isn't super skillful at relating. And you can be happy with him in a deep, deep way. And again, it depends on your thoughts, on how you're thinking about him, how you're thinking about yourself, how you're thinking about your relationship. How you think deeply determines your experience. Now, I would never say this to suggest you should just gloss over or ignore issues or really any of your feelings. This isn't about like papering over or kind of Pollyanna-ing things. That's not at all it. But to best address issues and best address your feelings and have the most power to make your marriage all that you want it to be, really your best bet is to understand this essential foundational thing, which is that your mental conditioning, your past experiences, the biases you've taken on from society and your family and like all your upbringing, right? In other words, your developed thought patterns and belief systems are the source of your feelings. They are generating the feelings that you have in your relationship, not purely your partner's actions. Yes, your partner's actions are kind of like the cue that can give rise to these thought patterns that you have, right? But they are not the reason that you feel how you feel, right? This whole web of mental conditioning is, right? All the thought patterns are why you feel how you feel. Any of the hard, hurtful, painful, quote, negative feelings you experience in your marriage are in large part because you've practiced the thought patterns that give rise to them for a long time. You've practiced these sets of beliefs, these thought patterns. You've practiced them. And so the feelings that come up when your partner does something that cues these thought patterns, they feel like they're coming up because of what's happening out there, but they're coming up because of what's happening internally in here. Now, as a sort of side note, I do want to say that when I say thought patterns, I mean the words that go through your brain, yes, but also the perceptions and fears and such that are sort of below consciousness, that are lodged more in your physiology, like your nervous system. Like these are your implicit, some of these are your implicit memories, right? But they're below your consciousness level. So they don't sound like words necessarily, sometimes depending, but they show up as strong emotions and reactions and convictions. Really, it's unconscious or below the level of consciousness programming. But we can work with all of this in a conscious way and with conscious thinking guiding us or helping us. And we do want to work with some of it on the level of the body, like through the body, but also at the level of the thought level, right? Because they really are deeply intertwined. And it's all still part of your thinking process, or maybe your perceiving process might be a better way of putting it, because that word sort of better encapsulates all of that. So, if we want to be technical about it, perhaps a better word would be your perceptions lead to your feelings. But to keep it simple, I use the word thought or thinking. Okay, so if you've ever noticed that it gets harder to step out of certain negative emotions that show up in your relationship over time, it's like easier and easier to feel those hard emotions, right? They come up more frequently. They're like almost like becoming concretized, cemented. That's the word I'm looking for. Cemented, right? The reason is this: what you practice grows stronger. And this isn't some new age concept. This is like neuroscience. It's that whole neurons that fire together, wire together thing. The more you practice something, the more concrete it gets, the more easy it is to just happen or show up inside of you. In other words, over time, these thought patterns get more entrenched, harder to step out of or see through. They feel, in other words, more and more real. And they tend to happen more and more easily, more and more frequently. So to give you an example, let's take what some of my clients call abandonment issues. So one client, for example, her father, as a young girl, was not very present. He lived with them, but he was hardly there, and he wasn't attentive to her or her mom when he was there, right? In other words, he wasn't very energetically present when he was around. And so in a sense, he had abandoned them energetically. And so over time, she started unconsciously seeing men as people who could and most likely would leave her or abandon her. And so in her marriage, the tendency would be to look for where her husband was not showing up or was not fully there for her. Every little thing he didn't do fully right, fully attentively, fully supportively, activated that old belief that men abandon you. And she saw evidence that proved this old belief, that reinforced it more and more, right? Because she was looking for that evidence, because she was looking through this lens of men abandon me. So the belief grew stronger and felt more and more true over time. And that feeling of being alone, not being fully loved or fully supported, grew bigger, more ever present, more easily activated by the slightest thing her husband did, even though her husband wasn't abandoning her and actually was present and supportive often enough. So what we believe, we experience, and what we practice grows stronger. In a sense, it creates our experience. And again, unfortunately, when we leave our brains to their own devices, to sort of their default, they will tend to want to go in this kind of direction. In other words, they don't tend to be looking for all the amazing things and looking at all the ways your husband's just showing up and loving on you. And right, our brains naturally are driven to look for what's wrong and missing as a survival tactic. And so that's what they tend to do. And it's, of course, then what they tend to find. And then, of course, we practice that a lot, and it just becomes our whole experience. Okay, but the good news about this is that because you can direct your thinking process in new ways, you can, for instance, stop believing something you've always believed up until now, right? You can stop believing men always abandon women. for example. You can start believing instead things that actually serve your marriage, even if you've never believed those things before or thought in those ways before. And as you do so, you will free yourself to have way more, quote, good feelings, such as connection and peace and lightness and love. And as you practice these new ways of thinking and believing, those thoughts and feelings will grow stronger. They will be easier to reach for. They will come up more naturally on their own and quicker, right? These thought patterns will be more accessible, and these feelings will come easier with more depth and richness. And you're going to naturally act from there, this is huge, in ways that generate more loving, cooperative, affectionate, harmonious ways of interacting with your spouse. And that's going to shift the tides in sort of like the bedrock or like the culture of your relationship. And really it's going to influence your partner to do the same. So what I'm saying here, this is the basis of amazing transformation in your marriage. And it's the beginning of a future filled with so much more joy and being a truly loving team in life with your honey. And having him feel like a honey instead of the non-honey he probably often feels like. If you've been practicing, relationship depleting ways of thinking, like so many of us have been doing. And once again, remember that this is a choice. It's a proactive choice to practice thinking in these new ways and to let go of practicing thinking in those old ways that make things harder. So it's an active choice that my clients make, obviously, when they come to me. They choose to do this work. They choose to learn how to shift their thinking and create a so much better marriage. So I wanted to give you one more example of how this can happen, how like this that I'm talking about is the basis of amazing transformation in your marriage, in our marriages when we choose it, right? It's the beginning of a much more joy-filled, loving life with your significant other. So my client, I'm going to call her Molly. When she came to me, she told me about how she and her husband were having so many arguments and she was feeling a lot of resentment and her emotions would get so big and she'd get really defensive and angry and she felt like she couldn't communicate with him well because everything would just escalate. Then, after they'd have these arguments or miscommunications, she'd shut down and it would take weeks to reconnect. So that might sound familiar to some of you. After we worked together for a while, at the end of our time together, she told me, and I'm going to read it as a quote, "This is what I always dreamed of having. My husband sees me maneuvering through situations so much better, and that allows him to see when he's being ridiculous, and then he circles back to me quickly and in a good mood, and he even gives me a hug. We haven't had a big fight in months, the longest time ever. It's a miracle in my eyes. I'm in a totally different headspace, grateful, genuinely happy every day that I have a great family." So that's quite a contrast, right? And the question is probably, what changed, right? It was her thought patterns and therefore how she felt and therefore how she related to herself and her husband. So at first, when she first came to me, her thought patterns, which I helped her look at and see, her thought patterns were very judgmental of her husband. Her thoughts were, he's not in tune with me. He's living in another world. What's with the stupid questions? He should spend more time with the kids. He's against me. This is just a sampling of her thoughts, right? Some of you might relate. And her thought patterns were very judgmental of herself, maybe even more so. Her thoughts were, I don't handle things well. What's wrong with me? What's wrong with me that I can't calm down, that I'm so sensitive, that I'm so emotional, that I'm so reactive? I'm a bad mom. I'm a bad wife. I'm a bad daughter, etc. Right? Again, this is just a little sampling of the kind of thought patterns that were going through her brain. So what changed was she started thinking about her husband differently. And she started thinking about herself differently. Her thoughts about her husband started to become things like, he is my partner, he's my teammate, and he just wants to be heard and understood, and he loves me and I love him. And about herself, she started thinking in ways that were more patient with herself, right? She was thinking understanding and encouraging thoughts about herself. Even as simple as, I am getting better at this and I can get better at this. And it's important that I take care of myself. Like, I matter. And as she thought more of these types of thoughts, she actually did take better care of herself. She met some really important needs for herself that she wasn't meeting. And it also led to her being able to listen better and help support her husband better instead of just demanding his support. This all led to, him being able to feel like he was heard and feel like he could get through to her. And so he was more willing to listen to her, right? And all of this sort of positive snowball effect. They started having a lot more fun together, doing fun things together. And by the end of our time together, I already told you where she was at, right? So just so happy and so proud of herself. And so feeling the love for her husband and feeling his love for her and just feeling like she finally had the family life that she always dreamed of. So the thought patterns that you either continue to fall into or that you decide to look at and actively change and then actively practice those better ones that serve you and your relationship better will determine your happiness or lack of happiness in your marriage. And yes, of course, ideally your spouse is learning to do the very same thing, right? Guide his inner world, shift his thought patterns that pull you further apart, and generate new ones that bring you closer. And by the way, I do have plans for a course for your spouse to learn all of this too. But you don't need to start there. In fact, you can only start on you. That will always be your only domain of real agency and control. And the good news is that it is enough. As I've said thousands of times before, as you change you change the whole dynamic of your relationship. As you change how you think, as you practice ways of thinking that serve your connection and cooperation and collaboration and understanding, you change everything between you and your spouse for the better. A relationship simply cannot stay the same when one person in it shifts the way they think, feel, and behave. So all of this is really a reminder to you of your power to improve things so very much between you and your spouse, and that your thinking and your conscious directing of it or guiding it or stewarding it and really practicing doing so in a relationship enhancing way, that is essential. I really felt it was imperative to circle back and remind you of this because it can be so easy to forget, as it's so different from a lot of what we hear out there about relationships. And it honestly isn't super instinctual to go here to our own thinking and internal world as a first source of relationship change, right? Like, how often is that your instinct? Like, oh, I'm mad at my husband, I better look at my own thought patterns, right? Like, most of us, that's not our instinct, right? And it's almost always right to go ahead and try to address that outwardly with our partner when we're angry or when something's not going how we want, right? Or to look to our partner to change. That's usually the instinct, right? And oftentimes my clients even come to me, and when they first come to me, they're kind of like, yeah, I know I'm supposed to look at myself, but let's focus on the thing he's doing wrong, right? And I totally get that. That's the instinct. And it's not that that's wrong or bad. It's just not the most effective approach by any means. It's so unlikely that you're going to make any real change or progress doing it that way. And so I wanted to, once again, put all of this that I've shared today in the forefront of your awareness. That where real change comes from is choosing to practice things that will make your marriage grow stronger. And that means choosing to stop practicing ways of thinking that generate more division and pain, and to start choosing to think in ways that generate the connection and mutual support and love between you and your spouse that you both want. It's simply an uphill battle if you try to go about it any other way. And this is why my clients get real, sustained, amazing results when they work with me, and why they didn't when they tried other approaches. So, if you want to do a bit of a deeper intellectual dive into this, check out these podcast episodes. I'm just going to mention a splattering of them. Episode number 6, that's how to work with your 2 brains for more love. Episode 16, that's called Uncovering the Source of Relationship Pain. And episode 13, sorry, this is out of order. It's called What You Make It Mean Means Everything in Love. And episode 17, 10 Beliefs to Improve Your Marriage. And then the last one that I'm going to mention today is episode 82. That's Changing Circumstances versus Thoughts. Now, all of these episodes will give you some more understanding and are a good starting place, at least intellectually. But if you're ready to make real change, come coach with me one-to-one, because understanding it intellectually is way easier than applying it or doing it in your own relationship, especially as a sensitive woman with big, strong feelings. That can make it really much harder, I know. And help can honestly be essential. I can help you see through the thought patterns and behavior patterns that you are practicing currently, which you may not see yourself, that are stopping you from having a great relationship. And I can help you start practicing the thought and behavior patterns that bring you closer and generate more collaboration and love. So come coach with me. It's late summer of 2024, and currently I'm taking one-on-one clients. In the future, it might be back to my group program. But for now, if you're interested in the one-on-one, in-depth, really personalized, cozy, intimate container, definitely take that first step. Learning more and filling out the join form, I am going to put the link in the description, or you can head over to www.lifeisworthloving.com and click the Coach With Me Privately button, and you'll learn all about it there. And I know that when you make this choice for yourself, just like my clients before you, you're going to thank yourself for making it forever. All right, my friends, be oh so well.